We are on a journey through the wilderness. Today we are going to look at Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 through 15. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we, that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard your complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, 'Draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining.'" And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked towards the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, 'At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God.'" In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." May we be blessed by the reading and the hearing of God's holy word. Amen. Last week, we witnessed God's miraculous, mighty work in this world as God's people were rescued from Pharaoh and his army. Their freedom had been won. By following God's guiding light, they had set out on their journey to the promised land. But in our reading for today, we see how quickly the tides have turned since God's people walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. In the verses between what we read last week and this week, there were magnificent songs of praise and thanksgiving. Bitter water was made sweet so thirst could be quenched. God promised protection if the people would listen to God's voice. But then we get to our passage for today. After a month of wandering in the wilderness, all those miracles and all the promises of God feel far off. People are hungry. They are tired. They want to know what's next. Where is this promised land of milk and honey? Not here. So the people start raising their voices. They get a little dramatic and decide that their leadership, Moses and Aaron, are the perfect targets at which they can lodge their complaints. "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." How quickly their memories have faded with regard to the suffering they experienced in Egypt. I'd rather die than be out in this wilderness with you, Moses, is more or less their complaint. The congregation's complaining is mentioned 7 times in this passage, 7 times. And spoiler alert, even after this, their complaints don't stop. Can you sense how hangry God's people are? That's slang for when you're hungry to the point that it makes you grumpy and angry. Hungry and angry, hangry. It's like those Snickers commercials that were popular a while back. There are 2 oddly matched friends, and one starts yelling at the other. Eventually, the friend who's getting yelled at says, "You're not yourself. Eat a Snickers." And with that first bite, the hangry is satisfied, and the friend transforms back into someone you'd expect to see. They're back to their normal self. I admit, I myself get hangry at times. The blood sugar drops, my stomach growls. It's hard to think clearly. Instead of filling myself with nourishment, sometimes I start filling up with gripes and complaints. But I recognize too that what's going on in our passage for today is more about a skipped meal or 2. It is a deep, deep hunger, one like I don't think I've ever really known, but that people all around the world and right here in our own community face daily. Things are to the point where the wilderness congregation doesn't know if they will survive, and it leads them to these bigger questions of life and existence. If we don't even have our daily bread, how will we make it through? My preaching professor, Ron Allen, and his friend, Clark Williamson, put things into perspective. Their hunger, they write, in the wilderness has led to Israel's loss of faith in God's project and in the leadership of Moses and Aaron. We who are well fed need to recognize that nothing erodes confidence faster than hunger. Their question is whether God, who performed the extraordinary deed of liberation, can provide ordinary food and drink. Allen and Williamson do well in getting to the heart of this hunger. In some ways, the Israelites are just getting to know this God of their ancestors. And while they've seen great and mighty miracles, will this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob really come through for them in this time of need? In some ways, our current context helps me to relate more to what those ancient people were going through. I admit not only my hangriness, but that I have lifted up my fair share of complaints lately. I have been stressed and anxious, tired, and sometimes plain exhausted, and I know I'm not at my best when I feel like that. I am weary of the wilderness of pandemic, of economic and financial strain, of division and hatred. It's hard not knowing how long this will continue, and it's hard not knowing what life will look like on the other side. Every day it feels like I have 1,000 decisions to make. And it's not just mundane decisions about this or that. It's decisions of life and death. If I go over to a friend's for dinner, could I unknowingly infect her? If we open up our buildings too soon, will someone get sick and die? Do we have enough volunteers who can sanitize for us? If we start singing again, will that increase particle spread enough that a droplet could fall on someone and infect them? I'm longing for that grand miracle of the parting of the Red Sea. I want the path to be made known, for the dry land to appear, for God to come down in that pillar of cloud and fire and light and to plainly point us in the right direction. I feel for our ancient ancestors, for Moses and Aaron and the whole congregation, for how overwhelming that wilderness felt for them. I understand their complaints, even if they do seem a little dramatic. But God led them out into that wilderness for a reason. It was in the wilderness where they would get to know who this God of their ancestors really is. It's here where they would learn how to trust. It's here where they would receive God's commandments and learn how to follow in God's ways. It's here where God would form them into a people, a nation. In the harsh terrain of the wilderness, they will learn that theirs is a God upon whom they can depend day in and day out. Allen and Williamson go on to learn from that ancient wilderness journey. They write, "If we look for God only in the mighty acts of history, we will be unable to see God in the simple realities of daily life, such as food, the kindness of neighbors, the love of family, the gift of children." I think they're right. Out in the wilderness, the Israelites will find God's grace and God's mercy, not in the drama of mighty acts, but in daily bread. We see in our reading for today that each and every day, God promises to provide the sustenance they need. It took time, though, for the Israelites to fully recognize and comprehend God's presence in the day-to-day. They had to shift their perspective and their expectations. When bread rains down from heaven, they can't recognize it in this strange new form it takes. This flaky dust on the ground, like frost from a morning dew, what they'll later call manna. At first, they can't recognize the blessing that it is. It's kind of like when you put something new on a little kid's plate and they go, "Ew, what is that?" The first time my parents had my new nephews over for dinner, of all things, they decided to make beef stroganoff. Is that one of the least kid-friendly meals there could be? One of the kids looked at this chunky gravy thing, and there was no way at all he was going to try it. There were hot dogs on backup just in case. The other kids were brave enough to try it though, and they loved it, so much so that they had seconds and thirds. It really was absolutely delicious, but it was unlike anything they had ever seen on their plates before. Sometimes we have to learn how to be receptive and open to God's blessings when they come in forms that don't begin to match our expectations. God did not lead the Israelites on this journey so they could die in the wilderness, but so that they could have life and have it abundantly, so that they could be a blessing to the whole world, just as God had promised Abraham so many generations before. It was here in the wilderness where they would learn what it was to be God's own, but it would not be easy. There would be more challenges to come. It will take time for God's people to learn to trust God and how to live God's values. For 40 years, they will be on this journey, and there will be more complaints. There will be more times when they can't bring themselves to trust. There will be challenges and questioning. But through it all, God will still be God. In the end, this wilderness journey will be a blessing. God will hear their cries and will respond with mercy and grace, not just in mighty acts, but day by day. The God who was with those ancient people in the wilderness then is the God who is with us in the wilderness now. Thanks be to God. Amen.